They said her name was Margaret Lenz, a widow, a healer, and a woman who knew too much about roots and moonlight. When they dragged her from her cottage, the villagers swore they could smell brimstone in the air. But what lingered in that cold stone chamber was something far more human than hellfire. It was the smell of damp fear, rising from the walls like breath. The scent clung to her hair, her clothes, the straw on which she knelt. It would become the scent of the forgotten. Margaret was not the first, and she would not be the last. The year was 1628, in the middle of Germany's most fevered witch hunts. The air itself seemed infected with hysteria, priests whispering about devils behind every cough, magistrates eager to cleanse their towns of anything feminine that could not be controlled. In that suffocating climate, they devised a method not of flame or blade, but of patience. They called it the water drop. It sounded almost harmless, gentle even, just a drop of water falling on a woman's forehead again and again, for hours, for days. But beneath that simplicity lay the architecture of psychological disintegration. One drop every few seconds, a rhythm too slow to fight, too relentless to escape. The mind begins to wait for it, to fear it, to anticipate the next one, until anticipation itself becomes torture. The inquisitors didn't need iron maidens or racks for this one. They only needed time, and women who wouldn't confess. Margaret was accused of making milk spoil, of causing a child to sicken, of speaking kindly to a beggar the night before his mysterious death. The charges were nonsense, but nonsense had power when spoken by men in robes. So they strapped her down, blindfolded her, and tied her head to the stone table. A small hole was made in the ceiling above her brow. A bucket hung over it. From it, a slow drip began to fall. Plop, plop. Each droplet of cold well water landed in the same spot, over and over. At first, she laughed, a cracked, trembling laugh. Surely this was nothing compared to the stake, she thought. But hours passed. The laughter stopped. The drops didn't. They came with mechanical indifference, like the ticking of a clock that had forgotten time. The inquisitors waited behind the wall, listening. They knew that within 6 hours, the human mind begins to perceive the drops as blows. Within 12, the body starts to twitch before contact, reacting to pain that hasn't yet come. Within 24, hallucinations bloom. A woman begins to hear voices in the rhythm, see faces in the darkness above. And when the dripping stopped, she begged for it to start again. That is the cruel genius of the water drop. It was never about physical pain. It was about ownership, of thought, of rhythm, of silence itself. When the accused witch could no longer distinguish between her own mind and the sound of falling water, they declared her broken. A confession would soon follow, whispered in a voice that wasn't entirely her own. The church would then call it divine truth. The villagers would call it justice, and Margaret, her voice trembling through cracked lips, would call it mercy. But make no mistake, this was not mercy. This was systematic madness, engineered to look holy. You see, in those times, women were not tortured for what they did, but for what they knew. Herbalists, midwives, widows, scholars, each one carried the dangerous inheritance of female autonomy. The inquisitors didn't fear their magic, they feared their independence. And nothing breaks independence like controlled isolation, like the slow realization that even the air, even the sound, has turned against you. Every droplet was a sermon. Every pause between drops was a warning. The torture chamber became a chapel of control, and still, the The smell of damp fear hung heavy. It seeped into the walls, the wooden table, the clothes of the priests who stood watching. Centuries later, when archaeologists found those underground cells, they said the stones still held the scent of moisture, like tears that never dried. It's easy now to look back and think ourselves beyond such cruelty. But listen closely to the sound of dripping faucets, to the hum of fluorescent lights, to the rhythmic beeps that measure our lives today. The pattern is still there. Control, repetition, submission. History doesn't always repeat, it drips. And yet, stories like Margaret's survive because someone dared to remember the smell, the sound, the terror that was meant to be erased. If you've made it this far, you already understand what Crimson Archive is about. We don't just tell stories of the past, we expose the architecture of cruelty that shaped the present. So before we continue into the depths of this forbidden method, before we understand how the water drop became a weapon of divine justice, take a moment, subscribe so that history's echoes are never silenced again. Because what happened to Margaret was not madness, it was design. And the next drop was already falling. The water drop was not born from superstition alone. It was born from calculated theology, a blend of religious zeal, misogyny, and bureaucratic precision. While the rack tore flesh and the stake consumed it, the drop dismantled the soul piece by piece. It was the preferred method for those inquisitors who wanted purity without blood, confession without visible sin. They called it a baptism of truth. The mechanism was deceptively simple: a bucket, a rope, a hole in the ceiling. But its perfection lay in consistency. A single, misaligned drop could ruin the entire ritual. The interrogators measured distance, angle, and height until the droplet fell in precisely the same place on the victim's forehead, like a clockmaker crafting madness instead of time. The victim would be stripped of dignity first, her garments removed, her hair tied back, her limbs restrained. The water, they claimed, must touch skin that had been purified. Then came the stone slab, cold as the doctrine that justified it. Beneath her, straw soaked with humidity. Above her, the bucket suspended in patient silence. And around her, the smell of damp fear thickened, clinging to the robes of the men who stood in judgment. To understand this torture, we must understand the psychology it preyed upon. Humans are built to adapt to chaos, but not to monotony. Predictable pain becomes unbearable because the mind cannot flee from it. Each drop of water forced the victim to anticipate the next. The waiting was worse than the contact. It turned fear into rhythm. Some women lasted days. Most broke within hours. The inquisitors recorded every reaction with chilling detachment. After the 200th drop, one note reads, the accused began to laugh uncontrollably. Another, the subject attempted to speak with the water, addressing it as mother. And then the entry stops. They did not need to continue. Once the voice changed, the confession followed. This was no accident. The churchmen of the 17th century understood something few dared to admit, that control of the mind was more efficient than destruction of the body. Burned women became martyrs. Broken women became proof. But why women? Why the insistence that this technique be reserved almost exclusively for them? The answer is buried in doctrine. The female body was seen as porous, unstable, closer to nature, and thus closer to the devil. Her body leaked, her moods shifted, her power frightened. To the theologians, the dripping water symbolized purification of a leaking soul. What they called witchcraft was merely the audacity to speak, to heal, to live without permission. In the dim cell, Margaret's thoughts began to twist. The drops no longer felt cold. They burned. Her heartbeat synchronized with them. Plop, 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 until she couldn't tell which was which. When she tried to pray, the rhythm interrupted her words. When she tried to scream, the water filled her mouth with silence. Outside the chamber, the inquisitor Father Reinhardt kept meticulous notes. He believed this method brought clarity to the feminine spirit. He claimed the water whispered God's judgment. His face, emotionless as stone, would tilt upward whenever a confession began. He never saw the women as human, only as vessels to be emptied. But the truth is far darker. The water drop was not a test of witchcraft. It was an experiment in obedience, a trial to measure how long it took to erase a human will. The same logic would later echo in prison cells, asylums, and interrogation rooms centuries later. The instruments would change, the principle remained, and through it all, the smell of damp fear persisted, humid, metallic, impossible to wash away. It clung to the ceiling, to the ropes, to the crucifix mounted above the slab. Every droplet carried with it the scent of a confession that wasn't freely given. Sometimes, when the victims began to hallucinate, they claimed to see shapes forming in the water, faces of drowned women, angels, or demons whispering through the drips. In some towns, the inquisitors recorded that spirits appeared to claim the sinner. In truth, these were the cracks of a collapsing mind. And yet, those very hallucinations were proof of guilt. To lose reason was to admit possession. To endure was to defy the church. There was no victory, only rhythm, only drops. As the hours dragged on, Margaretta's sense of time dissolved. The steady dripping became her world. She stopped fighting, not because she had no strength, but because she believed the water was alive, speaking, demanding truth. Father Reinhardt leaned close and asked quietly, "Did you serve the devil, child?" Margaret blinked, unable to tell whether the sound she heard was his voice or the next drop. "Yes," she whispered. "If it stops, yes." That was all they needed. The droplet fell once more, sanctifying her words. By morning, the scribes would record, the accused confessed freely under holy observation. By evening, the villagers would gather to watch her penance, and beneath the wooden scaffold, the ground would be dark with moisture, not just from the rain, but from the endless dripping that had stolen her mind. History remembers witchcraft as hysteria, but beneath the flames and trials lay something colder, quieter, more deliberate, a system that learned how to make the human spirit surrender without leaving a mark. Because sometimes the cruelest instruments are the ones that sound like mercy. The water did not wash away sin. It washed away identity. And the world mistook that silence for salvation. When the bells tolled at dawn, the confession was already written. Margaret's name, her alleged covenant with the devil, the night she supposedly flew to a Sabbath in the forest. It was all inked neatly on parchment before she ever spoke. That's how the system worked. The confession wasn't proof of guilt. It was a ritual of order. And as she was led out of the chamber, eyes blank, skin pale from sleeplessness and the chill of the cell, the smell of damp fear followed her like a curse. It clung to her hair, to the ropes that bound her wrists, to the robes of the priest who carried her confession. The stench of the torture room could never quite leave those who'd breathed it. Even the executioners avoided food for days afterward, claiming the scent turned their stomachs. They paraded her through the village square, not because she posed danger, but because spectacle was essential. Control only works if it's witnessed. The villagers watched her with unease. Some looked away, others spat. A few, mostly women, held their breath because something in Margaretta's hollow gaze reminded them of themselves. Beneath the sermons and prayers, they recognized the truth. This could be any of them, if they ever dared to think, to heal, to disobey. When the sentence was read, the inquisitor spoke in that solemn, almost tender tone reserved for sacred duties. Her confession was freely given, he said, her repentance genuine. Then, as the fire was lit, he closed his eyes and murmured a prayer. But what none of them saw, what history never cared to record, was that Margaret's lips were moving, not in prayer, but in rhythm. Plop, plop, plop. She was still hearing it. Even as the flames rose, the dripping continued in her mind. That was the true horror of the water drop. It didn't end when the torture stopped. It echoed. It rewired the brains so completely that silence itself became a weapon. Some women, spared from death, were released weeks later, only to go mad at the sound of rain. Others clawed at the walls of their cells, whispering to invisible leaks above them. Records from Trier, Würzburg, and Bamberg show a disturbing pattern. Women accused of witchcraft often lost coherence long before their trials concluded. The church called it divine punishment. In truth, it was the aftershock, a lingering neurological scar caused by the unending rhythm. The Inquisition had discovered a primitive form of what modern science would later call sensory breakdown. Deprivation mixed with repetition to collapse the psyche. The torture was not just medieval, it was experimental. They were unknowingly studying the human mind under controlled trauma. And yet, for all their faith in divine justice, even the inquisitors began to fear the method. Father Reinhardt's later notes turned frantic. "The water speaks," he wrote. "It whispers through the night. I hear it when none is present." He begged to be reassigned, claiming the devil lived in the dripping. 2 weeks later, he vanished from the records entirely. There were rumors, of course, that he sealed himself in a monastery well, that he drowned himself to silence the sound. But perhaps the truth is simpler. He just couldn't bear the smell anymore. That damp fear, that memory of women breaking quietly in the dark, clung to him like mold. The shock came not from the brutality, but from its success. The water drop spread beyond witch trials. It found its way into state prisons, into the asylums of 18th century Europe. In Venice, doctors used it to correct melancholic women. In Paris, wardens used it on political dissidents. They called it therapeutic exposure. By the 19th century, its spiritual justifications were gone, but the logic of control remained pristine. The line between religion and reason blurred. The Inquisition had simply evolved into bureaucracy, and through every iteration, the sensory motif stayed constant. Drip, drip, drip. A reminder that the most terrifying tortures need no blood, no scream, just patience. What began as punishment for witches became a manual for obedience engineering. Imagine it. Centuries later, scientists would study white torture, solitary confinement, and waterboarding, all sharing the same blueprint as that chamber in which Margaret lay. Each method stripping the mind of rhythm until it replaced it with its own, until thought became submission. But history only remembers the grand spectacles, the pyres, the nooses, the thunder of judgment. It forgets the silence between drops. It forgets the women who died before they died. In one recovered diary from a 1631 convent, a nun named Clara wrote of hearing dripping water during prayers. She claimed it was the devil's clock. What she didn't know was that beneath her cell, the inquisitors had once performed the same ritual. The sound had never stopped. The monastery built over Margaret's prison still stands today. It's well sealed, its history unspoken. Locals say that when it rains, the air inside fills with that same scent: wet stone, mildew, and something else, something human. The smell of damp fear. It is not superstition. It is memory. Stone absorbs everything: sound, moisture, pain. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. Steady, patient, unending. The sound of obedience being born. Because the true horror of the water drop wasn't that it caused madness. It was that it taught the world how useful madness could be. Centuries later, the cell still stands. Its walls heavy with condensation, its silence deeper than prayer. Tourists walk through it now, guided by a polite voice reciting sanitized history. They glance at the ceiling hole, at the uneven stone table, and whisper, "It doesn't look that bad." They never stay long enough to smell it. But if you do, if you breathe deeply, you'll catch it. That faint, metallic humidity, the smell of damp fear. It's not superstition, it's testimony. The stones have memory. In every age, the form of control changes, but its heartbeat remains the same rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. The sound has merely evolved into the flicker of fluorescent lights in interrogation rooms, the monotone hum of machinery in psychiatric wards, the endless tick of online notifications that keep modern minds from resting. The instruments are new, the pattern ancient. Control through repetition, madness through monotony. We often imagine history's cruelty as distant, primitive flames and rusted chains. But cruelty learned to whisper, to automate, to disguise itself as care. The water drop taught power how to hide in patience, how to erode the human mind without ever drawing blood. And isn't that the legacy of all great systems of domination? To convince the victim that they deserve their suffering, to transform torture into procedure, procedure into mercy, and mercy into silence. For the women of the witch trials, that silence was the final punishment. Their voices never returned to the record. Their names became rumors. Their confessions became proof of guilt. But every generation inherits the echo of those drops, whether it knows it or not. You hear it in the small cruelties that repeat until they become normal. In the way institutions grind individuality into obedience. In the way people apologize for existing too loudly. Each drop is an expectation, falling on the same spot of the mind again and again until resistance dissolves. That's why remembering Margaret Lens and the thousands like her matters, not because they were witches, but because they were targets of systematized fear. Their trials were not mistakes of faith. They were experiments in compliance. And if you look closely, you'll see that the same logic hums beneath modern civilization. Only the vocabulary has changed. The devils became disorders. The confessions became surveys. The dripping became data. But the aim, to measure how long it takes before a human spirit breaks, remains intact. The question is not whether we would have joined the inquisitors. The question is how often we already do, when we ignore the quiet suffering around us, when we mistake exhaustion for discipline, when we let repetition dull empathy, because control never announces itself with fire anymore. It comes softly, predictably, patiently, like a drop of water. And that smell, the smell of damp fear, it lingers in more places than we think. In hospital basements, in prison corridors, in the sterile air of offices where lights never turn off. The world has learned to sterilize its cruelty, to perfume it with professionalism. But Stone still remembers, and so should we. Margaret's story ends where the world begins to forget her. But stories like hers, women's stories, heretics' stories, were never truly extinguished. They seeped through time, carried by those who refuse to let silence win. If you stand in that ancient cell long enough and close your eyes, you might hear it again. Drip, drip, drip. Each sound a reminder, a call to conscience, a warning against repetition. Because cruelty is not a relic, it is a rhythm. And every time we choose not to question it, another drop falls. So if this story unsettled you, don't turn away. Let it stay. Let it disturb your quiet. That discomfort is remembrance. It's resistance. This is Crimson Archive, and our purpose is to break silence, to drag forgotten horrors back into light, to keep history from dripping unnoticed into our present. If you felt the weight of this tale, subscribe, share, and listen again. Because silence is the beginning of obedience. And memory is the only drop strong enough to break it.